안녕하세요. Good morning. My name's Karl Kleememire. I'm the head of Asia for Argus Media. I'm based in Singapore. And it's really a pleasure to be back in person again after a couple of years of having to do these events virtually. And I'm also very happy to be back in Korea again for the first time in 30 years. I came to Korea 30 years ago to work as a young engineer to work on a refining project in Ulsan. And I've lived here several months, and it's been a real pleasure to come back and get some authentic bulgogi and soju again. So thank you for the invitation. Today, obviously, I'd like to discuss hydrogen and the current hydrogen markets. Recent announcements around carbon neutrality, net zero emissions, have really, brought up the question of how do we actually get there? And obviously, hydrogen is the ultimate net zero carbon fuel. It's going to, that's where we need to get to. And I think there's still a lot of questions, though, around that is, what are the viable production methods for this hydrogen? And how do we transport it? We've heard some, the speakers have already touched on these things, but, that's very real issues. And so today I want to spend a little bit of time to review the current thinking around this and the costs, transportation, and some of what Argus has brought to this market. So let's see. There we go. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Argus Media, we are a price reporting agency, and we basically provide price reporting and for commodity markets around the globe, both for oil, LPG, metals markets, coal. We do fertilizers, petrochemicals. We're based in London, but we are truly a global company. We've got offices in 21 countries, and I'm very pleased to say we'll be opening an office in Korea later this fall. So we're really, expanding, and hydrogen is really one of our newest products. And as we look at it, it's still not really tradable, but we are heavily looking at it. And so moving right into the, wrong thing. There we go. So hydrogen demand has been booming, really, even before the decarbonization theme came up. As you can see from this chart, hydrogen has been an industrial gas for decades, and it's really heavily used in the refining and petrochemical industries, and as you can see a little bit in metals, in the steel industry. The growth has been really strong in refining in particular as the sulfur specifications on transportation fuels have come down. Certainly in the 90s, early 2000s, as sulfur specifications on gasoline, diesel came down, and fuel oil. Most recently, if you all remember the IMO 2020 spec changes on bunker fuel for shipping, and that was everybody thought it was going to be a big issue, and so that has increased the hydrogen consumption, and also petrochemicals have also given a bit of a bulge recently. So you can see hydrogen consumption has grown just since 2000 has grown over 40%, and that's just to date. So. Next slide. So we've got now a lot of the talk is biofuels, and we've got they're really set to take off, literally, to the extent that we're using sustainable aviation fuel as shown in the chart here. But the feedstocks for biofuels are renewable. Palm oil, used cooking oil, things that will recycle the carbon in theory. And those require extensive hydroprocessing. So as you can see in the chart here, we're currently at the front end of that curve. There's a lot of talk about biofuels, but actual production has yet to take off. And a lot of it's driven by government mandates. They're mandating certain percentages of biofuel as a percent of the full fuel pool. Sustainable aviation fuel, SAF, is one of the big ones right now. And you can see this reflects some of the mandates by the various countries. So you can see we're 2022, we're in really early days here, but making of biofuels requires hydrogen. So this is just set to add to the hydrogen demand. Let's see. Also HVO, which is the basic diesel equivalent, hydrogenated vegetable oil, a renewable diesel, a lot of people will call it. Same story. A little further ahead of the curve as far as production, but still a lot of growth coming. I believe Korea has some biofuel mandates coming up as well. So that's going to add to demand for these. Argus Consulting, we have a consulting arm that has leverages a lot of our price experience and commodity experience into evaluating projects like this. And we have done a number of evaluations, even for Korean companies. And that has we can see this wave coming, and it's going to also consume quite a bit of hydrogen. So but there's a limit to biofuel feedstocks. There's only so many palm trees. There's only so much cooking oil in the world, and it doesn't compare to the 100 million barrels a day of petroleum that the world consumes. So there's going to be limits to how far those mandates can go before the costs start to explode. But until then, there's going to be a significant hydrogen demand. And a lot of that, so what comes after that? As these decarbonization mandates grow, we're going to be looking at hydrogen to fill that gap. There's, power, PTL, power to liquids is one of the things that involves hydrogen. So basically, as we're looking at this, where is this hydrogen going to come from? Current refineries of the world are using what would you call black and gray hydrogen, either from coal gasification or steam methane reforming, SMR here. That, as you can see, they're not decarbonized. We'd call it unabated, I guess. We haven't gotten rid of the carbon. And on average, if you take a weighted average, we're at 14.6 kilograms of carbon for every kilogram of hydrogen produced. So, to the extent we're removing sulfur from fuel with the hydrogen, we're just adding to the carbon dioxide load. So really what we would term and so it's very carbon intensive. And obviously the new economy is all about decarbonization. So really, if you take everything decarbonized, really starts from the edge of that red box. And your initial wave, what we would call blue hydrogen, is you take a steam methane reformer and retrofit it with a carbon capture solution there with CCS. And you can see that gets us down to around 3 kilograms. So you've decarbonized significantly from the existing technology. If you have a new build with CCS, you can get it down even further with coal gasification. You get down about 1 or so with the steam reformer new build, or with autothermal reforming. And then you get down, obviously, on the right end with the green, using a renewable electricity or nuclear to produce using electrolyzers. So that's obviously where it's going to come from. Or going forward, that would be the current technology. Now, if you're like us, you've been overwhelmed by the number of projects being announced. There's literally been, we've cataloged 247 projects, hydrogen production projects announced since 2020. That's literally one every 2 working days. That's a lot of projects, and it's a bit overwhelming to catalog. But if you look at them, 80% of them are green hydrogen. About 20% or so are still in the blue hydrogen range. So you've still got some carbon emissions coming from those. It's good to see the green. But the other issue here is that those project numbers don't really tell the whole story, because the volume coming from them is actually much increased for the blue. So we got 20% of the projects themselves are blue hydrogen, but 33% of the volume. Each project tends to be bigger. And this gets into the size of the electrolyzers being used. So you've got more projects, but they're actually smaller capacity. And again, it has to do with the availability of renewable power, things like that. So if we move into that and have a look at that, and it gets back to something Minister McTiernan was talking about, is that we've been escalating significantly over the last few years. The projects have gotten significantly bigger. You've got the polymer electrolyte membrane technology, and as we've moved on to the alkaline water technology for the electrolysis, we've been able to scale up. And we've gone from 6 in 2019 to 10 in 2020, 20 in 2021, and we've got almost 150 megawatts in this year. So we've really started to ramp these up, but you can see we're still in the megawatt range. As Minister McTiernan was saying, the projects we're talking about now are actually in the gigawatt range and multi-gigawatt range. So I think there's a real question about how do we get there? It is a young industry, and by necessity you need to start small. But she made a very good point talking about the electrolyzer industry, and I'd like to highlight that you've got a number of countries here, and let's not focus on the number of countries so much as the difference between the dark blue bar, which is the actual operational electrolyzer capacity, versus the planned capacity. And the difference between those two, we're calling the ambition gap. How much would they really want? And as you can see, it's a huge difference. And there's some risk there. How likely is that? Now, one of the other things here, the green balls you see there are the number of companies in each of these countries working on that. And you've got China, you've got 10 companies actually looking at that. Germany has 7. The US has 5. But you've got a couple of countries there with just one company working on this. And some of them are coming from a zero base. So that's a risk. If you have a zero base, you have no operational, and there's a risk there that you're not going to be able to achieve this. Obviously, with more companies, even if a couple don't make it, somebody will. But there's a big gap between where they want to, the number of electrolyzers they want or need to build and the current capacity. And boiling it down to a regional level is almost more interesting. Is we've got right now today, you've got Europe and Asia with similar level of electrolyzer capacity, production capacity. The rest of the world pales by comparison. But look at Europe. Their ambition is greater than the rest of the world put together. It's it's interesting because if you go back, 10, 20 years ago, you would assume that these factories would all end up in Asia, manufacturing wise, et cetera. That's where, kind of this type of thing would be done. So it speaks a lot about Europe's perception about, two things really. They have led the world in this hydrogen, push for hydrogen, but their carbon, focusing on carbon costs but they also want energy security. And the Ukraine war has certainly brought that home to them, that we need to make sure what we're doing is in-house. So it may not even be the most efficient, but they have a goal of having much more electrolyzer capacity than the rest of the world put together. And we'll see if it pans out that way. But the other thing gets into the scale of the projects again. You've got the gigawatt, we talked about this. We've got 200 gigawatts of demand for electrolyzers. So they've announced these projects, but as you saw, we don't have a lot of manufacturing capacity. Building that capacity takes capital. Getting a bank to loan you the money for that would require you to have some firm bids. There's not a lot of firm bids out there for that kind of capacity yet. So there's, as Minister McTiernan said, there's several places in this whole hydrogen value chain. There's some chicken and egg going on. And there may be a necessity for some government support at some point to get that electrolyzer capacity up where a firm can actually accept a firm bid and stay in business. If they build this capacity and these projects don't come to fruition, then they have a problem. So that is an issue, and it's really, as we said earlier, you need electrolyzers to have green hydrogen. No electrolyzers, no green hydrogen, full stop. So that capacity has to come from somewhere, and it's really a critical issue that we're certainly keeping an eye on, and I think going forward it'll be important to realizing the dream of the green hydrogen. Looking a little bit at project metrics, some of these ratios are interesting, and it's good to keep in mind. There are a wide variety, and we've picked a few projects here, and you can see that the blue line is renewable electrolyzer to renewable energy. So the lower that blue line is, the more efficient it is. So you've got, and I'll give you an example. In the EU, they're pretty much relying on offshore wind for a lot of their renewable energy. And it's not always, you don't always have it at any given point source. You don't have a lot, so you just can't build that big an electrolyzer. So you kind of lose out in some efficiency there. Whereas in Australia, you've got solar and offshore wind, so you've got multiple options, and that helps you build a larger electrolyzer on site, and you get a more efficient situation. The orange line is actually the electrolyzer intensity, and the higher that is, the more hydrogen you get per electrolyzer, really. So those kind of go hand in hand, not exactly always, but the point is that some locations are more efficient than others. So there are places you would definitely want to build an electrolyzer just on a cost basis. It's going to cost, the hydrogen is going to be lower cost, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But there are other locations where it's going to be less efficient, but there may be other reasons you build there. So and energy security and the transportation issue, the places that might be the most efficient maybe don't need the hydrogen and they have to transport it, which then makes it more challenging to justify. I just want to spend a minute talking about. There we go. I want to talk about cost, but before we get into that, I think we need to talk about hydrogen intensity again. This whole sector is born from public policy. And the public policy is to reduce carbon intensity. It's no good to say, oh, we're going to burn hydrogen if we are back in the gray and black hydrogen. Great, we're burning hydrogen, but we're putting CO2 out just like we are today. We need to cut that down. So it's really important that we look at it in those terms. And so Argus has looked at that a little closer. It's lovely to talk about the colors, the different types of hydrogen production routes, and they're a great way to describe the route. But the reality is it doesn't always talk about the intensity. So as far as when we're doing our charts and our reports, we are talking more about we want to focus more on the hydrogen intensity. So we've broken it down into, and you'll see this on the coming pages, we've got a baseline, which is where we're at today. It's gray hydrogen, steam methane reforming, the baseline hydrogen production, which brings you in somewhere around 8 to 11 kilograms of CO2 per hydrogen. Then we have the BAT plus, best available technology plus carbon capture. And that brings you in a little less than 3, kind of like we saw in one of my early slides. That would be what we would call blue hydrogen as a route. We have low carbon, which is down around parity. It's a very efficient blue hydrogen, probably a new build. It brings you around 1-to-1, but you still got CO2. And finally, the last, literally no carbon, and that's your green hydrogen from renewable sources, or what they call purple hydrogen, which is from nuclear. So with that, as we look ahead at some of the sector fundamentals, and this is actually really interesting. The green sector, you can see the line is very stable. They don't have fuel costs. right? I mean, you got the sun shines, the wind blows. And so it's really about the investment cost and maintenance. It's pretty stable and coming down as the technology improves. The baseline in gray and the blue, which is the best available technology. And, it was, 2 years ago, the discussion was not about, was green hydrogen going to be efficient? It was, will blue hydrogen be cost effective versus the status quo? When will that be, at par? And certainly, there was a thought that, blue hydrogen maybe 2023, 24, and green hydrogen maybe 2030. But in the EU, they've obviously got some carbon costs, taxes, et cetera. They've incentivized that. And certainly the blue hydrogen and gray are, you can see it's actually caught up already. But interestingly, the green, and it's quite stunning, but the green is in the money. Even before, certainly with the current issues with gas costs, et cetera, and Ukraine, it's green hydrogen's cost competitive. But even before that, there were spikes in costs so green hydrogen is very, it's basically, you could probably justify a project in Europe today based on what we're seeing. So that's literally stunning. I mean, it was a surprise to me when I was looking at this. It's a little different story. And actually, I want to go back for a second and just look at that cost for green. We're looking around $8.50 to $9 per kilogram. If we go look at Asia, the costs are notably higher. Green hydrogen is quite expensive in Asia. It's just, you're at $11.50. You're $2 above what it is in Europe. Fossil fuels they're still well above fossil fuels. So and even blue hydrogen has a bit of a delta. So there's a ways to go in Asia. But at some point, Asian countries may need a carbon tax or something to get that in line if they want to at least put blue hydrogen in the money. So what happens to Asian companies or countries that want green hydrogen? Well, we've got to look at exporters. There are, we talked earlier about location being important, and these export-oriented producers are looking at something closer to $6. So that's an important number to remember, because you've got countries like Australia. Minister McTiernan was pointing that out. Australia, like Oman, like Mauritania, they've got cheap green energy, green power, and they could produce this, and that's a representative price. They also could do cheaper blue and gray, but those costs are much closer to normal. Then the problem gets to be transportation. Great, I can make it for $6, but what is transport going to cost me? And I think that's a piece I don't have time to dig into today, but it's really going to be critical to this step, is how do I make the hydrogen remotely and get it there? And then there's a security issue with shipping. So this partially goes part of the way to explain why you look at Europe. They may well be building electrolyzers, maybe a little less efficient, but at least they're right there. They're in their home territory. If they have the renewable power, they can do it there, and it saves them. It's the security and the shipping point. The shipping really, these exporters will do it, as Minister McTiernan was talking about, but you really need to look at ammonia production and cracking facilities on the receiving end. That will come, but it's yet to be really determined how well that's going to work. So I guess, I'd like to go on for a long time, and I think there's so much to cover, and I'm sure the speakers today will cover a bunch of it. But I think I'd like to leave you with it. There's a lot here. We've got, Argus has a hydrogen and future fuels report, and a number of items. There's other companies as well looking at this, but it's good to have some of this as background and understand how we're going to get there. It's so exciting. The Airbus proposals, it was fantastic. I think the end goal is great, But, we just need to make sure we get there efficiently and figure out how that is. And to do that, we need to understand the costs, et cetera. So I think Argus is one of those resources. We produce costs, we produce news, we produce fundamental analysis. And I please feel free to visit our website, or I'd leave you with this email here, hff@argusmedia.com. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us there. And with that, kamsahamnida.